Great. Wow, great to see such a full audience here today. Really happy to be here. As Andrew mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a project that has been occupying my mind and heart for many years now. Shortly after I started at Virginia Tech, I have a background in environmental science, and they had just done an urban heat mapping campaign, so mapping air temperatures across the city. And having this background in environmental science, they were asking me, what should we do with this data now? And so shortly after joining Virginia Tech, I started having these conversations about what to do with that data. And it became very clear that this question of what to do with the data was not a technical question, but one of organizational capacity building. And so you'll hear a little bit about that story today. And I'll preface by saying that it's been a very intensive kind of few years for me. I'm still in the process of trying to make sense of what we did together in that project. Apologies in advance if it feels a little bit scattered, but I'm still kind of in the process of making sense of it. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge that this project is not my project. It really is one that involved many people, and we had a leadership team, specifically in the past year we had a $1 million kind of funded project by the NSF, and that team came together with these partners from the community. So many of our decisions were made collaboratively about where to go on the project and how to focus our action. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the problem of extreme heat, which is what we sought to address in Roanoke, Virginia. Extreme heat is being exacerbated because of global climate change. So heat waves are becoming more severe in intensity, duration, and frequency. Heat domes can form anywhere now, as you all here in British Columbia saw in 2021. And in cities, that temperatures are even more exacerbated because something called the urban heat island effect. So the removal of vegetation, the introduction of man-made materials and anthropogenic activity makes cities 4 to 7 degrees Celsius on average hotter than the surrounding rural areas. But even within cities, you have neighborhoods that can be much hotter than other areas of the city, again, due to variation in where we have green space and heat holding materials and things like that. So when I talk about heat resilience, I'm talking about the ability of a community to prevent risks that are associated with these elevated temperatures, heat and extreme heat, or to adapt during conditions like during a heat wave. And I'll say that I don't believe that there's such thing as a natural disaster, right? Our natural disasters occur because of our lack of planning for hazards that we know are there, right? So risk as being a function of hazard, exposure, and also social vulnerability. So a little bit of our context in Roanoke. Roanoke is a small city, population about 100,000, located in the Appalachian Mountains in the US South. So compared to the rest of the US South, people think of it as having milder temperatures because of its elevation, but that is changing. So in the next 30 to 50 years, the climate in Roanoke is going to be more like that of the deep South, like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, than it is to its own, more similar to that of Alabama than it is to its own historical past. And its housing, people's behaviors, people's physiology even are not adapted to those conditions. Roanoke also has very low levels of what we call heat governance. And so it doesn't have, its emergency management plan doesn't mention heat at all. It doesn't they recently passed a climate action plan, but that plan doesn't really have teeth to deal with interventions that might actually lower risk for people. And then what you see here on the right is a map of the spatial distribution of temperature variations on a hot summer day in Roanoke. And so you can see there's a temperature difference across the city of about 8 degrees Celsius And the area that we're working in is northwest. The city is divided into quadrants, which is primarily African-American, and much of it was formerly redlined. So if you're not familiar with that, it's basically state-sanctioned racial segregation of housing and subsequent disinvestment of neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. So when I show this map, I show it and say that literally the effects of racism are built into the built environment. And even though redlining is obviously not legal today, we still see the spatial correlation with its effects. So as planners, there are a few things that we think that we can do to intervene. I'm just going to give a few examples. So things like changing surface albedo so that more energy is reflected into the atmosphere, or greening vacant lots so that you have evapotranspiration that again cools the surface of our urban areas, building splash pads, preserving urban forests, and thinking about shade infrastructure. There are also event preparedness things that we think that we can plan to do, like opening cooling stations or larger scale shelters for people where people can stay safe if the grid goes out or if they don't have access to air conditioning. So why am I talking about trauma? Why is trauma informed like a part of the title of my talk here? I wanted to present a few kind of vignettes that illustrate what I was seeing early on in the project. So I started off working with that data on air temperature that was collected across the city and trying to work with middle school age kids on an environmental science, place-based environmental science program coupled with urban planning curriculum. And so we were doing things like we were using sensors to measure temperature, surface temperature and air temperature, and how their body felt in different areas of their schoolyard. And back in 2021, when I did this exercise, there was a young lady who, when we were doing this exercise, refused to participate, right? So she slammed down her clipboard. She threw like the sensing materials on the ground. She demanded to be picked up by her uncle and didn't want to participate in this activity at all. So because later we kind of knew that trauma was prevalent in the community, we took a trauma-informed response and kind of gave her the space to process, her own feelings at that moment. We didn't punish her or anything for not participating. But later, when we were doing the urban planning pieces of this, we had the students interviewing each other, and she later told in her story that just the previous year, her family pet had died in their home because of heat. And so that's just one story of like how trauma is directly related to someone's experience of heat and how that behavior manifests when we're engaging about talking about these subjects. Okay, second vignette. So this is a picture of one of the units in the largest public housing unit in Roanoke, which is called Lansdowne. And I was interviewing a trauma response team member who part of her job is called the reset team. She goes after there is a shooting, and she goes to the community and kind of offers them resources for what had happened there. So she was telling the story about, she said, we had to go there in the Lansdowne for a shooting, after a shooting, and everybody was sitting outside on their stoop because it's so hot in the complex, in the homes. But also the adults there don't want the kids outside because of the violence. So they're saying you can't go outside, and these kids are stuck inside these places. And I'll just say later on, this past summer, we measured temperatures in these units, and the temperatures were 10 degrees Celsius hotter indoors than they were the outside temperature. And these units do not have air conditioning. It's not required in Virginia. So just again to say, the lack of control over their physical comfort in their own home exacerbates this experience of trauma. Third vignette has to do with how I realized the field of planning is correlated with trauma itself in the community. So I mentioned redlining, but another thing that's kind of even fresher in the memories of many of the residents that we sought to engage with is the period of urban renewal. So in Roanoke, there were 4 big urban renewal projects. Thousands of people were relocated from their homes, primarily African-American neighborhoods, but also graves were unearthed, and the remains of the people who were buried there were dumped in a mass grave outside of the city. And so this is what urban planning is kind of associated with in the imaginations of many of the people in the African-American neighborhood in Roanoke. Any intervention under the name of planning kind of triggers that trauma. And maybe the 4th vignette that I'll talk about is one that was a little bit surprising. But we were talking about tree planting because one of the reasons why temperatures are higher in this primarily African-American neighborhood is lack of vegetation and tree canopy cover. So when I had suggested, well, how would you feel if our project kind of focused on tree planting? One of my community partners immediately kind of shot me down on that idea. And she started questioning for whom the trees were being planted, because one, it takes a long time for trees to actually grow. So like most tellingly, who is this actually for? Is it for us or for some future population that might be moving in here or that might find this attractive? But also she associated it with policing. Because the city has an ordinance that allows for the issuing of fines if your landscaping is not kept up. And she was telling stories about how elderly neighbors were being fined for not mowing their lawns and asking how much more it would take to maintain trees. And is this just another way of the state like trying to police our community and fine our community, which was not what I was expecting to hear about reactions to tree planting. But again, goes to this deep distrust of any government intervention, even ones that we think of as good and correcting a past injustice. Okay, so this, in talking with the team, we also had a trauma specialist on our team. There's clearly a lot of trauma that is affecting the way that we can productively plan with the community, and we want to involve their voices. And so we've latched on to this idea of trauma-informed care, which is a concept from the mental and behavioral health professions that recognizes that trauma, we might associate trauma with PTSD or acute traumatic events, but it's also recognizing that trauma can be complex trauma. It can be the effects of daily racism in your life. It can be historical trauma. It can be intergenerational trauma. It can be collective trauma, and it is spatialized. And there are 2 components to trauma-informed care. First, how to understand the behaviors of those who have experienced complex trauma, and then providing some guidelines for engaging with people who have experienced trauma to promote healing, or at least not to re-traumatize them. So a few things I want to point out. This is from a framework called trauma-informed community building. But we all believe that the community should be involved in decisions, right? This is the motivation behind participatory planning and community building strategies, right? So what it does here is it takes some of those traditional community building strategies and it relates it to, well, why doesn't this work when you're working in a community that has experienced a lot of trauma? So for example, we want to build social networks, right? This is part of resilience, part of how neighbors check in on each other, and how we build collective capacity. So maybe we should, host a community barbecue or a potluck. The challenge with trauma is that because of that lack of trust and social cohesion, residents don't want to hang out with each other, and so maybe they don't show up, or maybe they come for the food and then they leave, and you get frustrated. Another is you want to engage the residents in planning and vision setting. So you conduct these visioning exercises, focus groups, charrettes, but you find again that in the community, there's this lack of stability, reliability, and consistency. So residents, not on their behalf, but in what they've experienced, they're tired of these empty promises of these visioning exercises, right? And they don't want to participate in a community building activity, or they're so overwhelmed by the fact that their children are exposed to gun violence on a daily basis, or they're having trouble putting food on the table or making decisions about whether or not to run the air conditioner or buy medication, that reality is overwhelming their ability to think about the future. And there's some more here, but I'll skip over this for time purposes. So our question was, that was an area called trauma-informed community building. What does this mean? What would trauma-informed urban planning mean? So I've listed a few kind of people who are starting to write about this idea from the planning literature. And this is just, representing some metrics or so about, possibly increasing attention to this idea. So our question is, in our case, right, empirically, how do these trauma-informed principles translate into the context of resilience planning? And so I'm talking about our $1 million project. It was funded through the National Science Foundation in the US to pilot a different approach. So recognizing trauma in the community, we had to make a lot more space for meaning making. The community itself to define what the problem is for itself, and then to hopefully get its solution. So we broadened, what we thought about what we thought was the problem of heat, to include a grassroots planning effort that was not only grassroots, but started with youth engagement. So we started with youth arts and spirituality programs, again, for meaning making, more broadly in the community about what does resilience mean to you in your community, and how do you define the problem of heat or adaptation? And then also youth place-based environmental science programs. Those two things, and we had dozens of engagements led by many other partners involved in this project. All of those engagements produced artifacts and reflections, which were put on a digital hub, so that anybody could reference them. And then we had a high school community planning program where high school students from Northwest, so African-American students from the neighborhood, worked with my graduate students and me and other instructors from their community to understand what planning is and to make sense of these artifacts in the context of planning for heat. Presenting that back to the community where the neighborhood would make plans for how to increase its own resilience on its terms. At the same time, we were trying to bolster community spaces of resilience, so building organizational capacity so that organizations from the neighborhood could be leaders in resilience for their own neighborhood. And then the hope was that this bottom-up approach would be accepted by the city in some kind of formalized plan. So I'll quickly step through, some examples of what we did. So this is an example of one of the arts engagements. It's a singing tree of resilience is what they called it. But you can see that the children were pointing out things that they thought would make their community more resilient. And we did not prescribe like heat as a thing that they needed to focus on. So some people said addressing violence. They wanted to be violence-free. They wanted more protection from police. They wanted more green space. They wanted kindness and a sense of community, more parks. another specialist, another academic partner. So in this community, this African-American community, places of worship are also very important kind of cultural hubs and social hubs. So she co-designed a whole Bible study linking Christian theology to ideas of urbanism and urban nature and even heat. So like refuge from shade. And anyway, there are many, that's not my area, but it was very interesting to see how that played out. So that's, back to our little conceptual diagram, examples of these youth arts and spirituality programs. We also, so examples of the youth place-based environmental science programs, we had, across different sites in the city, people doing sensor campaigns, wearable sensors, measuring temperatures where they thought it mattered in schoolyards, building solar ovens to understand kind of urban energy balance. We did some, as I mentioned, monitoring of indoor temperatures in the housing units of air quality and temperature. And that all produced data that went onto the digital hub. So here are high school planners. So this is them. They developed a serious game for planning a park in their own neighborhood. So this was really good for them because they learned that about trade-offs and how to negotiate trade-offs in space and how different users have different priorities for space. So they developed the game alongside my graduate students, and then they facilitated the game in the community multiple times. And we used the outputs of the game to inform the design for a park, which I'll get to in a second. And then they also had another stage where when we started to get some of those preliminary designs back for the park, they were representing the designs and explaining them to the broader community. So they were really, from conception of what they should do in the park, designing the game, facilitating the game, presenting results back, giving input back to the designers that they were working with, really intimately involved. I mentioned that they were also doing temperature measurements in Lansdowne, which is the public housing complex that actually some of them live in. So if you can imagine my concern with, we're involving these 8 high school students every day, right, in the summer, in planning for heat resilience, and I'm having to send these kids back to their home where their bedroom is 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The feelings that might elicit for me. But anyway, this was really important for them because they had the quantitative data, which then allowed them to present their lived experience alongside the temperatures and the air quality measurements that they took to the housing board. They made this little handout and of them collecting data. They also went around to each home so residents can put in their own air conditioning unit in the window if they can afford it. But there wasn't any data about how prevalent air conditioning was. And they found by a systematic review, visual survey of going around Lansdowne, that only 30% of the 1-bedroom units there actually had air conditioning. So again, that coupled with their lived experience and the quantitative data of the temperatures in the unit being 10 degrees Celsius hotter than the outside temperature was really powerful for the housing authority to hear about. And they also did these public, in addition to presenting to the housing authority, they also did public presentations on their work. So a really important part of trauma informed is that you're paying really close attention to how the people you're involving in this are responding emotionally and I guess in a mental health sort of way to what you're asking them to do. And so we were learning some really tough stuff with these kids, like about historical trauma, about redlining, about displacement, about things that directly affected their community, which was really tough. Some of them were hearing about it for the first time. And in one sense, they understood, right? Like that, this is why my community is the way it is and the way that I experience it. But it's still really hard to hear some of those things. So we tried to couple everything that we did with also instruction on wellness and mindfulness. So we went to, see the local co-op where you can, they explain like the economic model of getting groceries in a different way, right? And some of them had never seen like fresh food the way it was within their own city that way before. We took them to yoga. We started every meeting with mindfulness. And I will also say there was really tough stuff happening at the same time this summer. They witnessed 2 shootings of, not directly witnessed, but 2 of their classmates were killed by gun violence over the summer. And just to say, is heat the most important thing, the most important problem in their lives? Probably not, because there are all these other tough things that are happening. But what was good about focusing on the heat was that it was something different to focus on that did feel like we could do something together on. So anyway, just to give an example of how we were trying to approach this from a very holistic standpoint. So up to the next kind of level here, as the high school students were developing these, plans, visions, collecting data, representing the project, in parallel, we also had these all hands meetings, which were, there were 16 different organizations coming to these. 85 different individuals came. They all received trauma-informed care training at these sessions. And it was this iterative process of sense making of all of the artifacts and what the high school students were doing. And so at every stage, there was like a progression of what are we prioritizing as the problem and also potential ways to act in the future as we understand the problem more. And then over here, so an example of how we were trying to support the building of community spaces of resilience. This is the director, one of our members of our leadership team. She's also the director of the Hope Center, which is a local community-based organization. They function they distribute food, they distribute clothing to people. And in the past few years, they've also been opening their doors because they have actually what is a single window air conditioning unit, but people still go there to find refuge from the heat. People go there, they walk from, like, according to Miss Darlene, 1 or 2 miles away to access cold water that she hands out from the Hope Center. So they are already acting as a resilience hub of sorts that people go to, but they don't have the resources to connect with more funding. And so what we did was we supported through this grant, Miss Darlene and her board to undertake some nonprofit management consultation, basically from Virginia Tech. We have an institute that does that. They worked with her directly to develop bylaws, help her document, the number of people that she's serving, the types of things that funding agencies want to see so that she could access that funding. And I'll say that there was a ton of distrust also of what it means to partner with government on these things. But that was one of the things that we felt, if we're going to be trying to transform systems, that needs to be accompanied by reallocation of resources that requires us to partner with government. So about halfway through the project, we came across this opportunity to apply for a large sum of money. So this is through the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which is, billions of dollars, but to address climate transition, but also adaptation and environmental justice. So the Justice 40 initiative is essentially the goal that 40% of these benefits from these federal investments in climate, clean energy, and sustainability efforts need to go to disadvantaged communities that have been marginalized. The challenge is the capacity in those places to receive that funding is often not there, right? Because they've been systematically dismantled over time. So part of what the capacity that we were trying to build through working with Miss Darlene, building these coalitions across organizations, was to try to go after something like this. So we decided as a leadership team to try to do that. put in a collaborative proposal from the community-based organizations with the government to go after Inflation Reduction Act money. So we decided on 3 projects. One was bolstering Miss Darlene's Hope Center, the Community Resilience Hub, making it a completely state-of-the-art facility, complete retrofit, solar panels, backup energy so that people could go there and access air conditioning even overnight. Improvements to McCadden Park, which was a park that is very underutilized and a bit unsafe at the moment from users' perspectives, and how to activate that space. And then critically, providing air conditioning for every unit in Lansdowne, which is that public housing complex that I mentioned. And critically, like, these 3 projects were also accompanied by a different culture of decision-making. So we formed a steering committee from that kind of related to our project, but was an expansion, and we had to switch out some people, but also critically included representatives from Roanoke City government, because they would be the ones to provide the infrastructural capacity to handle a large federal grant of $20 million, because there's a lot of reporting, a lot of process that needs to be handled there that community partners just don't have that part, and they shouldn't be expected to have that part. So it was a huge kind of success of sorts to have members from the community sit at the same table with people from the government when they were previously not able to do that, and have tough conversations about how do you balance these 3 projects? What should the budget be for each of these things? How much is the city going to take? How much is going to support staff at each of these community-based organizations? So this was an example of that participatory budgeting process that was somewhat painful, but we got at the numbers and we were successful in submitting the grant. So really quickly, where am I in thinking about what we've done here? So I've kind of highlighted a lot of like positive things that I think came out of the grant, but I'm really struggling, just to be completely honest and transparent, about this process and whether or not we met the principles of trauma-informed community building. And the first one that I really struggle with is this idea of not doing any harm. Because while there were a lot of good things that happened, I think culminating in that $20 million grant proposal that was a collaborative effort between city government and these community partners, not everybody who started the project with us ended the project with us. And that happened in really tough ways. And I can say more about that later, but if there's interest in that, but that there were mental health issues that were triggered by the project. There were conflicts that were precipitated by the project that may have resulted in harm to specific people and even parts of the community that maybe were the most traumatized to begin with. I didn't see the trauma-informed community building principles until after the project ended. Like, I was drawing on other trauma-informed principles, but one thing that stood out to me from them was TICB only engages in activities when financial sustainability and organizational structure are guaranteed for multiple years and is not only focused on short-term activities. We got a $1 million grant for a 1-year project to do community stuff and trauma-informed community stuff. And I was under a lot of pressure to have that be sustainable. And I'm not sure if that was the right thing. And here I am now in a completely different place, not being able to guarantee that organizational structures would have stayed the same. So still struggling with that. But here, my unanswered questions about the relationships between resilience planning, transformation, and trauma, just bulleting out some thoughts that I have. So I come from this idea of resilience, that it's not bounce back after disaster, because back in many cases to the system that is unjust in the first place is not where we want to go. So building resilience does require systemic transformation, and people have to be included in that process. Systemic transformation obviously requires change. That includes change that is material like the investments that we're trying to get into Northwest. Change can and also should be institutional and cultural, but change is also personal. And change is related to uncertainty. Change is related to grief. Change is related to meaning making. And conflicts will arise in meaning making when you're trying to institute change. Conflicts in meaning can't really be resolved. So how do we build resilience or guide transformation in a way that doesn't re-traumatize people, and perhaps maybe even the most traumatized people to begin with? And what are the implications here, given that trauma is spatial? You could have whole communities that are traumatized. It's really hard to know if what you've done is the right thing at times. So just to end here, I think about this quotation a lot. It comes from one of my community partners who said, heat resilience is the name, but it ain't the game. And by that, I think she means that, yes, we had a focus on heat. No, it's probably not the most important thing in the community. But we were really trying to get at something else about how to change the culture of how we do things, institutions, organizational capacity building, the ability for people to collaborate with each other and access resources. Last thing. So I'm new to Vancouver, obviously. So Monday was my first experience of Reconciliation Day. And what struck me from that was there's obviously an element to trauma and healing and resilience there, but the focus on youth and intergenerational understandings of trauma and healing. And I feel like in terms of all we've done in this project, as I reflect on the project and what I'm doing here now, I feel really proud of the work that we did with the youth, the 8 high school students that I became very close with over the summer. And I left them when I was saying goodbye to them this summer with this excerpt from a poem by the US Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman. And it just says, that is the promise to Glade, the hill we climb if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. So thank you.
I wanted to ask about the different types of bottom-up responses that you got, because I was sort of taken by the fact that you realized that this was a trauma, like this community had a lot of trauma by the reactions that they were providing to the solutions. But I wondered if in addition to the reactions to the solutions you were proposing, the community had any genesis of solutions themselves that they proposed.
You mean like the solutions that we landed on, like at the end?
Not necessarily the things that you decided on, but I find that in community work, it's sort of bifurcates where you have this distrust of centralized authority because of past injustices, but then sometimes also communities going, well, why won't the government help us?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could speak about that tension, though, whether in addition to explaining why some of your solutions didn't work for them because of traumas with policing or something, whether they had any suggestions.
So we did a whole section of our work on what does collaborative governance mean in Roanoke to people. And there was this tension of, like, I'll just use the park as an example. So in replanning this park, that park, McCadden Park, doesn't have anything in it at the moment. But there are several community members who put out trash cans and take out the trash for that park. They're essentially doing maintenance for the park that the city is not doing. And so they feel an ownership over the park. right? So when we start to have these conversations about let's get the Parks and Rec department involved so that we can access this money to make improvements, the things that you want, there was actually a lot of people who balked at that because they felt like, well, once the government gets involved, like this is no longer going to be our park and we won't have control over it. So at the same time, though, it feels weird to suggest that this already overburdened and underserved community continue to provide their own services that the government should be providing, right? The government is building like an in-river kayak park, like in Roanoke, and they're complaining about maintenance of like this other park in the African-American neighborhood. Like that doesn't seem right to me. So, and it was weird because people from both sides actually fell on both sides of that conversation. So, that probably doesn't answer your question, but we did have to get at, in applying for the grant for the 20 million, we did have to define what is the city going to do? What is the city agreeing to take on? What are the community members agreeing to take on in terms of stewardship, in terms of design process, in terms of overseeing construction, or even where is the person going to be hired to, is it going to be a city position? Is it going to be a community position? And actually having those conversations about a concrete thing helped people kind of work that out. But I would say we got to something for the grant, but I'm not sure everyone was like completely on the same page. Yeah.
This is something that I often struggle with in doing qualitative work and work on the ground, is kind of navigating my own status as an insider and outsider. And so I was kind of wondering how you approach that in this project. It seemed like it was something for me that probably would have been really challenging. Kind of being somebody who spoke a part of the community in terms of the university and wanting to work on this, but of course not a part of the community that is, grew up there and is being impacted by these problems. And I don't, I'm not looking for a perfect answer, just, your thoughts on how you kind of work out with the trade.
I'm not sure if I have a very good answer for that because I am still really struggling with that also. I think though, a lot of it was dictated by where my community partners on the leadership team would allow me to go. Like there were times when they just said, Theo, do not go there. Don't touch that. Don't do that. And I really did rely on them to like, okay, there are times when that outsider status actually helps, a lot. And I did rely on them to help me kind of navigate that. Yeah.
I think that's actually a really great answer around like having community partners that you can trust to tell you, to be honest with you, like say in the lane or that strikes me as a really useful one. And I think part of why I asked that question is also just to say that that's like a thing that many of us think about and don't have a good answer to. That's hard.
Yeah. It takes a lot of kind of noodling, searching around and getting put back on track by different people, I guess. I think that this idea of moving forward, like with a specific action, is what precipitated like why unresolved conflict is really difficult, right? So the IRA funding, we could go after $20 million for this community. Do we want to go for it? Even though we know that members of our team have some unresolved conflict. And I guess it was a lot of, not everybody, I guess we decided to move forward because it felt like a big enough benefit that could come to the community. But I've been thinking a lot about like Peter Maris's work in planning and like also Leonie Sandercock's work about, both have talked about the psychological aspects of planning and Leonie particularly about this idea that planning can be therapeutic. I think that there's this stage in the meaning making part where if you're helping people to make their own meaning, it can be therapeutic. But once you have to make a decision about like, you're doing a budgeting process, you're like choosing projects that will be included or excluded. The conversation is not really about meaning making anymore. It's like bargaining or negotiation. And some people are not going to be ready to do that process, and it's going to be highly emotional. So should we have had like a parallel process of like screening people for like, hey, this process might hurt, or like this is what this process might look like? Probably, right? But what I struggle with is that would people have screened themselves out and then not been at the table for a really important decision? And I'm not quite sure, like, you know, there's kind of like two things, right, happening at the same time. There's a meaning-making thing, and we could have continued the project that way and not made it about concrete projects and investment, but we decided to go on to the concrete investment thing, and that changed the context. So I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
The individuals who you're working with, how do we talk about that with that? To be very honest and say, we're using the trauma-informed approach. What is the language? How do you approach that? Because in itself, that could be somewhat damaging.
So it actually came from the community. I didn't prescribe the trauma-informed thing. I think Roanoke may be somewhat unique in that this word trauma is used a lot because Roanoke was one of 3 cases written about by Mindy Fullilove about the effects, intergenerational trauma effects of urban renewal. So trauma is connected to urbanism in Roanoke, and everybody's read this book. So everyone is telling me you have to read this book. The trauma thing came from them. But to your point, it actually did introduce a lot of confusion and difficulty, because if everyone's talking about trauma, it is traumatizing. It can be re-traumatizing. And also, I'm not sure if this is the right way to say it, but I did feel in some portions of the project that people were kind of weaponizing trauma in ways that were not helpful. I don't know if that makes sense, but it made a lot of things kind of difficult, which is why my question is like, how do we actually operationalize the trauma-informed concept in planning when you can't guarantee that people won't be harmed? And also everyone has their own, like there's not a path, although trauma is collective, the path to healing is individual, right? Or at least it's been defined that way. So what is the path back to healing on the collective level? Is like a question I'm not sure we can answer. So I don't know if, you know, trauma-informed should be used. Anyway, I waver back and forth because I think it was useful, but then also like not in other ways. Yeah. There was a very prominent trauma specialist in Roanoke. Everybody knew her, and she wanted to be a part of this project, and that's why she is a mental and behavioral health specialist. But I think she works with individuals as a counselor. So this was kind of, she does some community building stuff as well. But I think trying to apply the principles of trauma-informed care from the mental and behavioral health to an urban planning context where it's like, by definition, a collective issue was a challenge. And we're still trying to like talk. I just talked with her this morning again about like, how do we make sense of this? And we're still like working through it. So yes, we did have a specialist, but the context for her was a little bit different than what she normally works in.
Question that you don't answer those, honestly. First one is, I might have missed this, but in the proposal, was there anything included to shift dynamics between the community and the city, where the city also has to put in work and how they manage their communications with community members? That's the first question. And the second question is, as somebody who's marginalized but also working in similar spaces, I found myself, and I was listening to some of this, starting to dissociate, because I was like, it's the city's work. It's not, you know, it's not something that we have to keep bringing up for others to actually take into consideration. So how did you manage that? I'm sure there were points of despair somewhere in throughout this project, and how did you, or did you even have to, you know, play a role in uplifting spirits or support, etc.?
So, yes, we did have this explicit like intention to link to formalized government processes. And that I was having those conversations in the beginning of the project. Community members and government were not ready to come. We're not ready to have those conversations together. So I was having those like, okay, we're going to do this project. We want it to be bottom up and involve these organizations, but I want it to link back to the comprehensive plan. I want it to link back to the climate action plan and to real investment back. And so I had like the oral commitment from the city that, yes, we're going to try to do this, but it was like throughout the 1 year, always kind of like, is this actually going to connect at the end? Like the community is going to do some stuff. Will it be accepted by the city? Will there be material resources that come? And that was what kind of propelled us onto this IRA pursuing the funding thing. So I think, is that your first question? So to me, it was always like, yes, the city has a responsibility to make material changes, right? And cultural changes. And can we get them to do that by the end of the project? And to your second question about like being depressing or like, you know, how do we uplift the community? I think the arts and the spirituality pieces and involving the youth were that. So like, it wasn't all gloom and doom. Like the community was able to define for itself what resilience meant for it. And so that, you know, there was some very uplifting stuff there, like a giant float that was created of like this water goddess and people coming together around Larry the Log Perch, like, and children were involved. So the whole kind of aura was actually quite uplifting, which was making me reflect actually on Monday about the intergenerational march and the presence of children in that completely changes like the whole feel of something that could be traumatic and hard, really difficult. But I think that balance was, that's how it kind of came across. So I think this is maybe the biggest takeaway is like, what are the precursors, understanding the precursors to community, like authentic community participation. So we all believe in like, the community should be involved in things that are happening in their neighborhood. But I guess what was exposed by acknowledging trauma is that there are reasons why sometimes there's barriers to participation from the community that have to do with trauma, and how that process can be better built in to a longer term healing process, I guess, that isn't just project based, I think would be my answer to that. So it actually, maybe like going back to the quote, heat resilience was the name, but it ain't the game. Like, yeah, this was about climate adaptation, but it was actually about something else. Martino, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Theo, for the talk. My question is actually picking up on what you were talking about. One of the things that struck me is exactly the quote that you left with. And there's something else that you said in the talk where I think one of the community members had said, actually focusing on heat takes us away from the daily challenges that we face. And I wonder, you know, in the context of being an educator, I reflect on this myself. You know, what is it that we can leave, you know, our interactions with students, with stakeholders, etc. And I think in the context of this tension of always being limited by projects that are, you know, receive short-term funding, how does one build that longitudinal capacity? And something that I'm left with that at least inspires me is, you know, is there an opportunity to displace despair with inspiration? And perhaps some of the best things that we can do is just plant that seed for someone else to take forward. And so in the context of, tackling that tension of building longitudinal capacity and infrastructure in the community that you're working in, did you get some kind of sense of, other people taking the work forward? Or how can one systematize that in a way that really does lead that sense of inspiration instead of despair, and empower those people with tools to actually take that forward?
Yeah, that is hugely important. And actually the like name of our project is Hope for Heat Resilience. And HOPE is this acronym, healing our people with empathy. The community partners came up with that because we had this whole long like NSF title, but they were like, we need to shorten this. So HOPE was actually central. Like we did not want this to be about despair and trauma. And what I didn't talk about is actually the trauma informed has another half to it, which is healing centered. So we did try to foreground like the hope and the healing and the resilience that already exists in the community. That it was always this balancing act though, because especially I would say for people who have experienced trauma, like sometimes it's hard to move onto like, okay, let's like heal now, which sounds really, what's the word, kind of dismissive, like, or can sound dismissive. Anyway, but I would say that the project overall did not have like a feeling of despair to it. And then to your point about like, is somebody taking on things? Yes, like people are continuing the work in their own ways, which I think is encouraging. We had a lot of artists involved. We had who are now incorporating like environmental justice concepts and into their work. A lot of the churches were involved, and the youth of 8 high school students that were involved. Like I'm still in contact with them. One of them is in college now, where he thought he wasn't going to college. 2 or 3 of them have said they were considering a career in community planning. So I think that they do feel like they could do things. Like this idea of self-efficacy was apparent throughout, even if the collective efficacy, I think the collective efficacy might have been like hit or miss, but like the personal efficacy definitely, was there for the kids.